Welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us for our September Monash Partners Consumer and Community Involvement Lunchtime Seminar. I'm Angela Jones from the Monash Partners team, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's session where the focus is going to be on incorporating consumer and community involvement into grant applications, and delighted to have Professor Helena Teede joining us for today's webinar. We begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land and waterways on which our Australian partners stand. We pay our respects to their cultures, their elders past, present and future, and continue to uphold their ongoing relationship to the land. I'd also like to acknowledge and pay my respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us for today's webinar. As a reminder, Monash Partners has some extensive consumer and community involvement resources available on our website. They're self-paced modules along with tip sheets about how to engage with consumers using technology, guidelines around remuneration, and also incorporating consumer and community involvement into clinical trials, and all of those are freely available via the web address there. Also to highlight, our colleagues at the Western Australian Health Translation Network have just recently released a module, a 30-minute online module that's available freely to everybody across Australia, and it's an introduction to consumer and community involvement in health research. It's available by their RET program, and the address for that program is just available there in the slide also. Just to remind you, we'll be audio and video recording today's seminar. We'll make it available on the Monash Partners website and via a link post-event. We would welcome your comments via the chat. Today, Sandy Braff, our Monash Partners CCI fellow, is joining us as well, and we will be monitoring the chat. Thank you, Sandy. If you have questions and you'd like to prioritise questions coming through the Q&A, you can do that via a thumbs up. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Professor Helena Teede. Helena is the Executive Director of Monash Partners. Helena, thank you so much for joining our monthly CCI seminar. You wear a number of hats as a clinician, Executive Director of Monash Partners, and also an NHMRC Research Fellow, Leadership Fellow in Implementation and Impact. Can you kick off by telling us a little bit about your roles and your research?
Thanks, Angela. So as Angela said, I'm a clinician, and I think many of the questions that came from my research came from that clinical context and background. But I've always held NHMRC fellowships, and the evolution of those has been from benchtop research through clinical and now into implementation and impact. It's fair to say that on my personal journey about 10 years ago, I got quite disillusioned in that the research that I was doing was meeting metrics, was resulting in grants, was resulting in publications, which was terrific, but wasn't really changing practice. It wasn't really impacting. And for me, that was my raison d'etre. So research is my Trojan horse. In other words, it's the disruptive strategy to drive change and to bring together collaboration. And so on the journey, I became quite disillusioned because it just wasn't having enough impact, and was fortunate enough to have a sabbatical where I was able to go around the world, do some professional development, but also visit the leaders and leading places that had managed to drive collaborative improvement and research translation, or really getting the value out of research on the ground. And none of that journey was about specific methods that they used for the journey that they had, but more about the culture, the mindset, the leadership style, and the approach and process that those individuals, organisations and systems applied to having impact. And at the same time, along my career, I'd become very aware of the fact that deciding that you understood the problem from your expert perspective, whether that was as a clinician or as a researcher, inevitably led you with an inaccurate understanding of what the problems really were, the lived experience for those with the illness, and that in part was enlightened on the journey of being a carer, if you like, for my father, who developed terminal malignancy, and it was a long journey. And even watching that journey and participating in that journey was actually very enlightening in terms of the way that just the whole experience of being part of a system, but not really part of the system. The other perspective I would add is that the community, us and the rest of Australians, are the funders and they are the beneficiaries of both our health system and all of our research, which is almost, in this country, a lot of our competitive research is publicly funded. But until fairly recently, they've really had no role in making sure that both of those actually meet their needs. So there were some fundamental epiphanies that I had along my journey that led to a very different approach to the way I work and the way my team works. And there's 120 amazing people who work with me in the Monash Centre for Health Research and Implementation. And at least for the last 10 years, before we call them patient and public involvement or consumer and community or end user or whatever you want to term them, we've taken the approach that the needs, the problems and the priorities of the people we are working for, who are effectively the communities and end users, are more important, in fact. And if we don't start there, then what we design is unlikely to be pushed through or pulled into practice and unlikely to really make an impact and provide a solution for those we need. And so I suppose we started working in that way quite some time ago. And once you start genuinely doing that, there's no going back. You would just never do it any other way. So my roles now, to answer your question, are as the director of Monash Partners, and Monash Partners connects our community researchers and clinicians to innovate for better health. And as the director of the Monash Centre for Implementation Research, which focuses on impact, from research to deliver impact as a clinician. And I have a number of government policy advisory roles around how to change the system to make working with stakeholders and understanding the problems and driving towards solutions more effective.
Helena, can you tell us about your early days as a researcher and what really influenced and shaped your thinking about the importance of partnership, consumer and community involvement and stakeholder engagement? Obviously now it's a requirement of many funding bodies, but that's not always been the case. So you've been working in this space long before it was required. So what were the early factors that really shaped your interest and commitment to this?
Possibly it's partly personality and leadership style. So I did an exec MBA program many years ago. I didn't put my hand up for it. I was sponsored to do it. I was a clinician and an NHMRC fellow at the time and had two beautiful children, my second of whom looked like Michelangelo's cherub, but I swear had horns under her blonde curls. So life was pretty challenging at the time. But I was sponsored into that program and I've subsequently done a Williamson leadership program. And one of the reasons I mention those is they really shaped my thinking about you get much more insight into your strengths and weaknesses and really being able to think about yourself as an agent of change almost objectively. How do you bring about change? I also would say that my gender had something to do with it, but not necessarily what you might think, and my career stage. So I was a young woman trying to get people to collaboratively work together. And I'm not that old, but when I first qualified, there was not a single specialist physician role model there were a few, but they had either decided not to have a family and be a full-time clinician, or they decided to have a family and be a very, very part-time person. There was no one doing what I really wanted to do, which was have a family, academia and clinical work. And so my role models and my sponsors, if you like, were the male colleagues around me. But the reason that was important is I didn't necessarily think the way many of my colleagues did, but I was a disempowered junior, usually only woman on the group. So it wasn't the fact that I was a woman, but I was different to the many leaders that were around me. And so how I developed strategies to perhaps change perspectives was not about necessarily trying to compete, not being in a hierarchy. I wasn't the boss. I didn't have that authority and influence. I wasn't necessarily the image of a credible leader back then. I very much was reliant on going out to the people who really mattered, all the stakeholders, gathering the intel through structured processes that were credible, and making sure that what I took back to the table was not my personal opinion, but was actually data-driven, evidence-based, and consensus agreed. And the more I took that approach, which was really to empower me to influence, the more profoundly I was affected by the fact that clearly none of us as an expert, even my wiser older colleagues, in fact, sometimes especially my wiser older colleagues, really understood what the problems were. And most of us, and the title of this talk is fantastic, you know, how do you incorporate consumer and community involvement into your grant application? And the reason the title's still there is I'm going to tell you that you don't, because if your question is how do you involve CCI in your grant application, you've already failed. And the reason I say that is you need to start way, way back at the concept of what you're going to do before you get to your grant application. And it doesn't have to be, you know, requiring a great amount of resource or time. It's your mindset. So one of the critical things is that if you want to solve a problem genuinely with your research and you want to make an impact, you have to understand the problem. And problem ideation, it doesn't matter what perspective you bring, even if it's diverse, clinical, research, you know, change agent, you'll never have all of the perspectives unless you put all the key stakeholders in the room. Even if it's a key workshop well before you design your project, but you need to understand the problem ideation and the priorities of those around you and what they need to solve their problems. Because if you don't start there, what you design as a solution, like this is my project, will you be a consumer and sit on my governance panel? Will you be a consumer and review my, you know, my dissemination outputs? Will you attend my meetings? Is still missing the point. So actually making sure that you understand the problem and you've got your consumers involved from the outset, and actually understand the direction you're going to go in and the nature of the intervention that you're going to develop has to start way back when. And it may only be a 6-month lead in time to a project or a program of work, but you need to do it to make sure that you're doing the right thing that's actually going to be meaningful. And the more I did that, and the more 360 or 180 degree turns I did from what I thought we might be doing, and we've designed this lovely project, here we go. I might give you some brief examples if I can. So we had co-designed with consumers and stakeholders a lifestyle intervention program that was for mums before, during and after pregnancy. We've done lots of NHMRC randomised controlled trials, and not to self-congratulate here, but we've had $52 million worth of grant funding, and they've been primarily from Category 1 grants. So this is highly reputable, credible research. But almost all of those have actually started with that planning, with the concept of the problem, and with a co-designed solution. And so with that program we've done with the mums and their lifestyle, all been co-designed, we went out to some of the core groups and refugee groups in our local area in Dandenong and talked to them about, look, we've got this program, it's evidence-based, we'd like to work with you to, you know, design it for what you need and adapt it and, you know, work with you to do that. And after half an hour of listening to them, basically what they said, and we talked about healthy mums, healthy families, basically they came around to the fact that that was all very nice, but the reality is their 6-year-old spoke English, was more literate, more computer savvy, and pretty much paid the bills and the tax in the family, and that made it incredibly difficult for them to parent. And so there was no way they could control the healthy food and the food in the family and control the, you know, the children and their diet and the healthy lifestyle, because they couldn't even parent with that sort of power dynamic change. So what they wanted was something completely different, which was actually about parenting and that sort of power dynamic in a recent immigrant context, before we could even get to what a healthy lifestyle intervention looks like. And so, you know, that way back down, you know, so that needed to be something completely different. Likewise, we got a whole lot of stakeholders and women together for a workshop about 2009, because there was a particular women's health condition that was neglected and had 6 different health professional groups in it. And when we started working with the women, they were delayed in diagnosis, very dissatisfying experience, inaccurate information provided. And so we got everybody together to ask them what research questions were important. At the end of that day, which was largely led by and driven by our consumers, we decided that actually what we needed was evidence-based guidelines, and then we worry about research. So it pivoted in completely a different direction. In other scenarios, which others have brought to me more recently, actually I'll give you one other example. We're doing a project at the moment, a research project about consent, and Angela, you're very aware of this scenario. It's about consent to access data and to be available to be contacted for research, but it's a research project about that. And in the process of doing that, we were going to engage consumers, do qualitative research with them, and really co-design what they think is appropriate for when we're communicating with them about potentially being involved in trials. And so I held a consumer forum with them and said, look, we're thinking about doing this sort of focus area on consent and what that means. And before we design what we're going to do, can we just talk you through it? And I honestly ended up with a completely different perspective after an hour listening to these consumer groups. And it was around the fact that they find being involved in research very transactional, very one-sided. It's about, there's this trial, I sign over my consent, and the consent form is all about risk and risk protection for the organisation and the ethics and the pharma company, all about just telling me as a consumer, about all the things that are terrible that might happen for you. And there's a little section on, what you might get out of the research. But it's transactional, it's passing over the concept of risk and responsibility. And there's very little about what's the reciprocity. Why would I do this clinical trial? What's in it for me? What are you giving me? And what am I giving you? And so it's not a contractual partnership, it's actually a transactional volunteership. And so clearly the way we frame clinical trials had to be completely different, and the whole project completely changed. And the influence of that one conversation on the national platform that's been developed around clinical research has been influenced. So those are the sorts of things where you can start back, fairly early, understand the problem, from an hour's meeting, from a workshop, it doesn't need to be War and Peace, but really making sure you understand the problem. Then you'll get much greater buy-in if you then collectively develop a vision, and then the nature of your project will fall out of that. I'll talk about it later and remind me if I don't, but obviously that process is different if you're doing discovery research, if you're doing a set clinical trial, versus if you're doing the more applied research. But even especially in the clinical trial space, there's still some really important lessons that need to come and be incorporated into that.
I think one of the big challenges for research groups is often doing that stakeholder engagement piece ahead of the funding, securing the funding, but we know how important it is. I just wonder if you could share with everyone today, when you haven't got funding available, what are the kind of resources you can use and draw on to do that really important piece of work before you even sit down to write the grant or do anything else really?
Yeah, so there's a number of strategies that you can use around that. The first is it doesn't have to be War and Peace. So it just has to be genuine. It has to be, it does need to be professional. On the resources on the Monash Partners website, going through what is consumer and community involvement, making sure you're aware and you've done the training and you take the right approach, using some of the descriptors around the tools that are there, those sorts of things are all available. But it doesn't have to be, a huge qualitative research piece to be able to tell you what you should do. Having forums, stakeholder workshops, actually working with consumers and open-mindedly listening to them, not giving them this is my project, what do you think? But actually, this is the area that we're really working in. Yes, I'm going to come back to the basic science one, thank you, and I'll make sure that we'll come back to, there's a comment in the chat box. But from many groups, if you're not familiar with it, it's not your bread and butter, coming to groups like Monash Partners and getting some support, that's what we do, to facilitate workshops and engagement, and being able to talk about how that informs your whole program of work. So it doesn't have to be for every project, it's how you've captured the key problems and then linking them through to policy priorities and other areas where you've got clear evidence that consumers have prioritised this. It might be the support groups who've also prioritised that area. How can you draw on that? There might be an international priority setting for the groups like James Lind Alliance, and there are many groups like that you can link into. If you're not familiar with how to do it, reach out and get some support and advice, would be my advice. Stakeholder workshops are a very, very effective way of doing this and understanding the problem. And the other thing too is that sometimes you can incorporate into your grant. So there are now increasingly almost every grant we write, and they are successful. They're really good quality NHMRC, ARC, and also MRFF grants and Horizon 2020 grants as well. We actually incorporate that into the process. So we outline the broad overarching project we're going to do, but the first step is we actually have a project officer who's funded to do some formal stakeholder engagement to refine things as part of the project. And that's the first stage. So the first work package 1 is stakeholder engagement and co-design, co-production, tweaking the sort of project, if you like, and work package 2 is actually, then doing the RCT or whatever it happens to be that we're doing. So we actually get funding up front for that process of end user engagement, and it then runs right throughout the program. And it's definitely acceptable. In fact, if you put in a grant where you are talking about consumer and community involvement and you've got no funding to pay the time for the people who need to be involved, and you've got no strategies that genuinely are doing that, and no commitment of staff and time and project planning for that, then it's probably not genuine. So actually doing a bit before and articulating what you've done and then integrating it into the front end of your project is quite legitimate. In terms of grant, can I come back to that basic science question, Angela, if that's okay?
Yeah,
so it's highly variable how much engagement you need. But I do remember giving a talk not long ago, and one of the benchtop researchers I really like and respect and has done some amazing work came up after and said, I've been working in Parkinson's disease for 20 years and I've never met anyone with Parkinson's disease. And I have no idea what their lived experience is like. And I must say, I hadn't really thought about that until this particular forum. I think the point, I suppose, is that if you are a world expert in a particular niche, genomics or metabolomics or particular niche area in discovery research, that's where you have to work. You can't pivot your methodology to do something completely different, and that has to be respected. And you're going to want to work with the best people in the world who might be in New York and Berlin, not necessarily with the people in your immediate area. So the nature of the research you're doing, especially blue sky discovery research, is never going to be one where you need to understand how to fix the daily quality of life issues that someone with Parkinson's disease has. But you do need to be informed by the biggest problems and the most significant challenges and the population broad priority areas within Parkinson's disease as you design your program. I remember having this discussion with a very senior learned colleague a few years ago when patient and public involvement or consumer and community involvement was starting to get some traction. And we talked about the fact that having some insight into those priorities and those needs and those lived experiences, even at the benchtop level, was important, because we needed to think about those things in terms of the investment of the public dollar. Was that going into something that was going to be really meaningful for the population, or that sort of high level? And one of the discussions we had was about infertility. And we were talking about the biggest priorities for infertility at the time were age-related infertility and obesity-related and metabolic impact on the basic mechanisms that impact fertility. And the response of the team was, well, we're not interested in that. We just like the basic biology, and that's what we want to do. And I made the point that actually the public's funding what you're doing, and that we are beholden to think about what the biggest and most important problems are, or the really big problems when we're doing our research. So even at that benchtop level, there's an important need to frame, why is it worth the Australian public investing in your research, besides the fact that it's exciting science? Why is it that this is a legitimate body of work that's going to have a health impact? And you won't always know the answer to that, but there are some people, and I remember I've read many, for example, of Gail Risbridge's grants, and hers are very, a great discovery research, but her front end reason why that discovery research had to be done was absolutely compelling. She had really close links in with clinicians, but also had links into the consumer groups, and had a really well-framed reason for why what she was doing was really important and how it could potentially feed into a whole lot of other things down the track. So it's thinking about culturally putting your mindset in that fact that you are a problem solver, but you have to know that the problem that you're solving is a genuine problem from the community perspective, and that you may just be a part of that solution, and you might not be able to guarantee that your solution will change something. Nothing I do, because I don't do benchtop research anymore, nothing I do is ever going to develop the next cancer drug. What I do is make sure that what is developed actually can get out into practice in my own research. But the discovery researchers still need to think about how you're framing the importance of what you do, and where is the policy priority, where is the prevalence, or where is the nature of the problem, or the burden of disease, or the justification for why the public should invest in what you're doing. I hope that helps. And it doesn't mean that you need to have a huge personal stakeholder workshop. It might be that you can find evidence of the priority setting that's occurred in that particular condition. And increasingly, many consumer groups, in fact, they come to us. We've got cystic fibrosis, Prader-Willi, motor neurone disease. Those groups come to Monash Partners now and say, will you help support us? We've got money for research. We want to go on this journey around setting priorities and then partnering with you to fund activities in those areas. And that's happening increasingly. And that includes from discovery research right across. Can I just make a comment about clinical research? And I'm on the ACTA implementation research committee, and that was very enlightening. So I do large-scale clinical trials. I wouldn't say I'm, a learning expert in them, but I have many, including Horizon 2020 grants, etc. And one of the things about that that work is if you don't think about what problem your research is trying to solve and design your intervention around those sorts of problems and consider that what you're developing is actually implementable, then again, you're probably wasting that public money. If you design a dietary intervention that has 16 intensive sessions, not only is it probably not practical or feasible for the people who are participating, but no one's ever going to pay for it. If you design a trial where your problem, and in fact, colleagues came to you recently for some advice about this, they had a problem where we're really good at thrombolysis and stroke, and we're actually reasonably good at clot retrieval. Very high tech, very expensive, but we're not so good at getting aspirin into people, really simple preventative intervention. And so one of the reasons for that is in Australia, we have a policy that everyone has to be swallow tested to be safe for aspiration risk before they can have anything orally, including aspirin. But that's not the policy in the UK and the US, and there's much better aspirin administration without necessarily a significant blip in aspiration risk in those countries. So the question was really, how do we work out who should be retained to wait till the next morning and they can have a speech pathology assessment, and who really should be getting the aspirin? And they were going to do a randomised controlled trial to answer that question. And when I sat down with them, I said, well, first of all, you need all the stakeholders together and you really need to understand the problem. And when you understand the problem, I can pretty much guarantee you, you will not design a randomised controlled trial because you know that aspirin is effective. What your question is completely different. Your question really is about what level of swallowing, safety and aspiration risk. And it's going to be a very, very different question. You're going to bring all that evidence together and then probably develop an implementation trial, because it's a practice change and you need to evaluate and capture that data as you move forward. So they flipped and even just that discussion about thinking about the implementability and what problem they were solving. And when they put the consumers in the mix around the choice that they would have of potentially the major benefit of aspirin against the very, very small risk of aspiration on different risk scales, that becomes a pretty powerful voice to start to change different tribes of health professionals, allied health and doctors and different stakeholders. If you put the patient in the room and actually say to them, we're all trying to make decisions about this risk balance, actually the patient and their family have a role in that, consumers have a role in that, and the nature of the question and the nature of what you design changes.
Helena, can you tell us about some of the strategies that you use to ensure that the consumer and community involvement in your programs and grant applications is genuine, active and meaningful?
Yeah, so I think again, I'll come back to that. If you don't start with the problem, then how can you be part of the solution? Within the limitations that we talked about, if you're discovery research, you're going to work in your particular area. If you're developing a clinical trial, you might pivot and do a different design, a different nature of intervention. If you're doing an implementation trial, it'll be completely different. The complexity of the intervention changes as that, so you go across that spectrum. But for me, it's around, if I'm working in a particular field, no matter what grant it's going to be, I've got a really good feel for the problem in that field. And that you can do that independent of any one grant. You can do that stakeholder engagement, and if you need support to do it, you can reach out to the Monash Partners team, look at what's on the website, look at the examples of publications around that. But I must admit, for the big programs of work I do, I actually do that in a formal way and I publish it. And my PhD students do a lot of that work. In terms of workforce, they will often do a systematic review and a stakeholder engagement program that they lead, and that's very publishable in quite good impact journals, actually. So we would form a reference group, an expert reference group, We would do a systematic literature review. We would often then go on to do stakeholder engagement, sometimes qualitative research, all under the auspices of that PhD, and have a really good consensus view that we agree to through things like Delphi methods. So Delphi is that you develop a whole list of priorities informed by your systematic review and your research, qual research. You send them out to your stakeholders. They rank them, add any extra. Then they do a second round where they rank them again. Then often we'll have a workshop in there, but it doesn't really matter if you do. And then we have a third round where we rank them again and we get a consensus and we'll publish that. Now that is a big body of work, and I'm not saying you need to do that for every project, but for things like Centres of Research Excellence, so we actually host 3 Centres of Research Excellence. So the reason we do that, I think, is because that funds collaboration, stakeholder engagement, workforce development, research and translation, which is why I like that sort of grant. Partnership grants are the same. But that body of work, whether it's a PhD student or whether it's yourself that does it, that can take a bit of time, but it should set your whole program of research up. You don't need to do it every time. It can be at a suitable high level. You can either do that, you can do it in the context of a funded project. So as I said, it's actually step 1 of your research project is to do that refinement with stakeholder engagement. So you can actually have it funded and have the resources in there. So there's a number of ways to do it. And as long as you can articulate the way you did it, as long as it's transparent, it's genuine, and you can articulate the outcomes, and in our case, we often publish the outcomes, then that becomes a really valuable thing to do, or an investment that you may only need to do right up front in terms of your program of work, and then make sure you've got your stakeholders involved in your governance structures and advisory groups. I have consumers on my governance group. I have them involved in my the investigator teams. They are authors on my manuscripts. In fact, I've got a couple coming out shortly where the quote from the consumer is the first thing that's in the actual manuscript. And when we're designing the manuscript, the consumers actually help us shape them. So they're involved in not just governance, they're involved in the outset, setting the problem, setting the solution, helping design the nature of the intervention. They're involved in the governance, and they're not transactional. So it's the way you think. If you think they're just there to read your grant application or to read your dissemination and output, then you don't have that real value from those consumers. But if you see them as a genuine partner and as an expert in that lived experience and listen to them, that makes a really big difference. And so there's all those strategies I just talked about, but it's more about thinking about it not as transactional, not as consulting with them, but as them as an empowered partner with equal power, if you like, on the journey as part of the team. I pay some of my consumers EFT as part of the group. Others I pay on an hourly involvement basis. They have a PD. And again, you don't have to invent all these. They're all available, and we've got resources around those sorts of things from Monash Partners. So I think there's a range of strategies, but if it really is genuine, it needs to make sure that it conveys and operationalises that culture of mutual respect and genuine partnership.
Helena, can you tell us about your greatest learning over the years as you've engaged stakeholders in your research, not only consumers, but often clinicians as the end users of your research outputs? What is it that's been your most compelling learning?
I don't have to get up in the morning and know what the problem is, and I don't need to be the only one who designs a solution. And that's sort of my biggest learning in everything. I just need to set the processes up and the systems to, and bring all the experts and the different perspectives to the table. It's where the magic happens. I know that might sound really corny, but it just is getting a lot of people together and really listening to each other. Working with policymakers, they have a lot of power, but they really, sorry if I'm offending anyone, but often they have no idea what what it looks like on the ground. It's just like researchers often don't know what the lived experience is, or you only engage with clinician academics, not necessarily frontline clinicians. So my greatest learning is if you really want to solve a problem and research is your vehicle, and you genuinely are going to use public money for good, so not to do the grant and not to do the publications, the output, but to make a difference, incremental difference, then you must understand the problem. Now, the other thing is that we do have a range of resources. Yes, so Monash Partners, there's a question in there about having programs in place to support and empower consumers. So we train consumers, we support them, and we've got a whole range of resources for researchers and for research, but there's a body of work going on at the moment, a lot of work actually, around consumers in healthcare improvement or in more applied contexts. So it's come from a research perspective previously, but it's evolving to involving consumers in more of that, more applied space. And that's happening a lot more. So I don't know if that lesson is helpful. I'll give you one other anecdote on that actually. I'm on the international advisory panel for the large centres in the UK. And I went over as a mentor advisor not long ago. And these are centres that for 12 years have been funded to improve healthcare through research. And you would have thought that they would work in a sort of similar problem ideation solution way, but they still sit outside the health system and study it. They don't necessarily really think about how they can improve the problems. And I was mentoring, and we were doing like a speed dating thing, and all these young, fantastic researchers would come one after the other and sit in front of you, and almost all of them had the same problem, which is we've done this great research and we had consumers involved and we had stakeholders involved, and they advised us on our project, and they sat on our steering committee, and we finished, and we've given them this great project, and it hasn't gone anywhere. No one's done anything. They won't use our work. And every time I said to them, how do you know what the problem was that they wanted you to solve? Did you start by asking them what the problem was? How do you know what the greatest need was? Did your project help solve their problem? And if you think about this in commercial world, you would never go and do development of a product if you didn't know what the need was, if you didn't know what the pull was from your market, and if you didn't think and check back with your market at every point of your work. But we don't have a mindset of researchers often as solvers of problems. And that's right from discovery right through. How do we make sure that we think about being beholden to understanding the problem and being the solution? So I suppose that's my biggest insight.
Thanks, Helena. Just to let everybody know, we are developing some resources for consumers, and we'll launch those in the coming weeks. We'll have a dedicated space for resources to support consumers, so we'll send out a notification around that, and please look out for those. Helena, I'm wondering what advice would you provide to a researcher who's really keen to involve consumers in their research, developing their research program, and just starting out with that? What would be your advice to them when they're just starting?
Yeah, so I think it depends where you sit across that research continuum. Again, if you're doing discovery, really important discovery research, you need to think about how you would need to engage with consumers. You need to do it directly yourself. You don't want to do it one by one, you'll exhaust the community. But is there a way you can tap into? Is there a support group or a group that's already available that's done some of the work that's important for you? Can you link into, for example, many of the themes in Monash Partners, the children's theme, the women's theme, are developing consumer and community involvement committees? Can you tap into ones that already exist? And how much involvement do you need for the type of research you're doing? Then the second thing is understand what it is. And there's some really good definitions on the Monash Partners website. What does it look like? What does it mean? How could you do it? What sort of strategies could you use? What tips, what practical ways of doing it? So I'd make myself familiar with those resources. If you need, I'd get support, and Sandy Graff is online. He's one of our fantastic fellows who's done some amazing work in developing these resources, but also in providing support, and Angela Jones leads this platform. So we do a lot of work to give advice to people as well. But don't think, in fact, I'd implore you not to think every single one of you for every single project needs to go out and get a full consumer and community involvement strategy. You tap into what's existing, work out how much and what level you need, understand what the different strategies are and how you might implement them. And you might come together with your whole department or even your institute or your field with many others and say, actually, we need to do this together. And so it depends if you can do it collaboratively as well. But I think to start, go and learn about what it is and what sort of strategies can be involved, and get some guidance if you need it. And then you can articulate those strategies quite specifically in your grant application. So we come now to the question, which is how do you put it into your grant application? If you've really done that backgrounding work, depending on the level of engagement you need, if you can really make a solid representation for why this is a community priority and how you've justified that in your background, then you need to think about how you're involving them in your project. And again, depends on where you are in that research continuum. But just say we're talking about a clinical trial or something that's more applied, you would link into, ideally, the consumer group that perhaps is in that particular area and have a representative nominated by them. You might have someone with lived experience on your steering committee. That's not an onerous thing. They may only need to, engage in a regular basis, but you should have a position description for them and a remuneration policy. And that should be very clear in your grant application. You can make sure that they receive training, and so there's training available, for example, through the Monash Partners platform. And indeed, many people now actually incorporate the Monash Partners component and leadership and guidance into their grant applications. So that's one strategy. And then how are you reaching out, depending on how applied your research is, to different levels of stakeholder engagement? Do you have a consumer reference group? Are they a diverse representation of consumers? Do you need outreach strategies to capture those that are not going to volunteer? You're non-elite capture. You're not your CEO of cystic fibrosis, but actually your non-English speaking, perhaps low SES parent of a child who's not going to volunteer for any of these things. How do you reach out to those more underserved populations? And when that becomes important, you need a different set of strategies. And there I won't go into detail, except to say you probably need to engage with a group like this to be able to give you some expert advice. So thinking about where you are in the continuum, what level of engagement you need, and what the sort of strategies are to do it, and budget it in your grant. If you don't have a genuine budget in your grant, how are you actually going to deliver it? And seek help if you need it.
Excellent. I think also a number of people often find that they're midway through a research program, and they're looking to involve consumers. So I think some of those ideas are really, really helpful. Engaging with culturally and linguistically diverse communities is a challenge, but so absolutely vital. So I'd encourage any of the research teams out there who are wanting to do that to contact us. We're very, very willing to support in that type of activity as well. Absolutely.
Maybe, Angela, can I just say it might be worth talking about what Monash Partners has done at a national level so that every researcher, one of the things we find in our job is that we look across the system and everyone's in their hamster wheel. So everyone's asking, how do I now do consumer and community involvement? We don't want every individual out there to have to struggle through, I don't know how to do this, I'm going to learn how to do this myself. There are things that can sit at that systems level that groups like ours can help with, and there are things that your institute or university or whoever it happens to be or your hospital might help with, and there are things you need to do as an individual. Make sure you know what's available. So Monash Partners has done a lot of work on what was out there, what was needed, co-developed and co-designed a whole lot of resources that are about to be expanded, develop this support service, actually increasingly integrating staff into different budgets and groups and helping support that. But you don't need to be an expert in it yourself. You need to be able to leverage off what's actually out there, if that helps.
Helena, is there anything over the course of your years working in research and working with stakeholders that's not gone to plan?
Oh, yes.
And how did you manage some of those situations?
Well, interestingly, yes. If you're going to be brave and courageous and try different things, you'll always fail. You'll always, and in fact, Monash Partners is a good example. It's 4 steps forward, 3 steps back, sometimes 5 steps forward, 6 steps back. But again, if you've really genuinely engaged with your stakeholders and you understand the problem, and everyone's co-designed the solution together, no matter how hard it is, it gives you a courage and bravery to go, yep, as long as we keep going in terms of steps forward, we're getting there. An example, that we've developed data sharing principles for our health services and our partners around agreements and simple processes for sharing data. I don't know how many of you use data in your research, but it is excruciatingly painful and ridiculously bureaucratic. And in fact, quite inefficient and high risk. And lots of people running around with USBs and data, personalised data on their laptops, and there are just, it's just not done very well. And that's not a problem for each one of you to solve in your research units or your research, your programs. It's actually, how can we help everybody? So we've gone out, done all of our research, engaged with so many people about identifying the problems, lived experience of doing research with data, and engaged our consumers and all of our the policymakers, everyone else, and then designed a system. I used it the other day. All credit to Alison Johnson in our team, and I think it honestly would have taken me 10 minutes to go through this incredibly fantastic approach to sharing data, and that would have gone out to 6 different organisations at a time. So it's sort of about how you solve the problem at the system level. And I suppose it's, in a way, it's what we're trying to do with consumer and community involvement. This is the way we do things around here. We work with, we partner with consumers. We think about the problem from their perspective from the outset, and we just work with them because, we wouldn't do this without them, because they are the funders and the beneficiaries and the end users of what we're going to develop.
I guess also just to let people know that there are a couple of projects that have been underway that are about to deliver some really useful resources. One is a project that's been led by the Western Australian Health Translation Network, and it's around a handbook that outlines best practice in consumer and community involvement, and that's in the final stages of development. Will be launched by the Minister of Health very, very soon, and then will be available. So we'll certainly send an announcement and post that on the Monash Partners website. I think that will be enormously helpful. Thank you for one of the comments coming through. One of the benefits of these sessions that we get to link with new organisations and collaborations. So it's terrific to hear about an organisation working with children and adolescents and young adults in cancer, and thank you for that. Helena, so much. I have to say our conversations a few years ago when we started prioritising this for Monash Partners and developing the Monash Partners platform were that there'd been a lot of progress internationally, and we had a lot of work to do in Australia. And I think in recent years, we've contributed to that, but there's been enormous effort by many groups across Australia. Where do you see the future of consumer and community involvement in Australia in the next few years? What are some of the exciting opportunities to take things even further than where we are now?
I hope the future is that essentially we do have that fundamental respect and understanding that the community, which includes us, are a partner in what we do, and it is the way we do things around here, and that we would not think of designing a solution or running a research program if it didn't address the problems, needs and priorities of the people who pay for it and the people who are going to benefit from it, so that we just thought differently and we behaved differently. I think that would be hopefully where we're going. And you do see that genuinely in many places, for example, in the UK, where that respectful partnership is just the way we do things around here. So I would hope that that happens. I also think it'll become much more professionalised. So you asked me about mistakes, and yes, there are many, which is how you learn, and resilience is all part of this journey and very much part of research, as everyone online will know. But even with consumer and community involvement, I've been involved in forums that I have not, I've just been a participant, and I've walked into rooms where really senior colleagues who are clinicians are in the room with a lived experience expert, a patient who had this particular condition, and all of a sudden they've flipped into, well, this is the nature of my problem, and I've got diabetes, and my HbA1c in control is this, and the clinician has turned into the doctor, and the power balance has completely changed, and all of a sudden the doctor is counselling the person on the management of their diabetes. Completely inappropriate. They're there as a lived experience expert. They're there with the voice broadly of the community, and that just does not, that is not, that shouldn't happen in that space. I've also many times seen consumers or consumer groups who are such strong advocates for their own political agenda or perspective, but that's actually not representative of the community either. And it might be very powerful politically. And I'll give you one example. There was a consumer group and a very passionate parent who'd lost a child from a particular condition, and they decided to lobby for something they thought would have solved that problem when there was no evidence that it did. In fact, none whatsoever. It was a technological solution, and they went directly to the health minister, and all of a sudden we had a $52 million national announcement for something that was not evidence-based. And actually we could have used that $52 million for so many more things that the rest of the community was passionate to have. So isolated consumer advocacy has its downsides. And as much as isolated expert or isolated clinician advocacy probably shouldn't have its place either, it's about bringing that collectivism and understanding the needs, but not necessarily having the consumers drive the only solution. It needs to bring evidence. It needs to be clinically appropriate. It needs to be that joint hearts and minds. And the way you do that in my learning is to do it professionally, is to have training, is to go in and say to people, I led a guideline across some 71 countries and a lot of big egos. And we had a lot of consumers involved. And I had to go into the forums beforehand and train my colleagues about what their role was in this guideline development. What was the role of the consumer as the expert lived experience? How we respected their voice in the room, what that looked like. And then I also had a challenge in that where one of the consumer groups was actually a commercial operation in the end, and there was a lot of concerns about governance and transparency, and they had an agenda. But we had sent a survey out, very simple survey, which reached 3,500 women around the world. Very quick exercise. And that actually came back and completely contradicted their particular political agenda. But we had grassroots up evidence that that was not what the consumer groups actually wanted. So there are so many things that you can see going wrong, but when you've got a feeling in your gut that something's not quite going right, think about mitigation strategies. But keep it professional, keep it transparent, make sure your consumer has a PD and understands their role, make sure they're trained, try and limit the political perspectives in there. Make sure you do it well. You would never do your research poorly. Don't do your consumer and community involvement poorly either.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Helena. We're coming up to the end of our session today. We've got a couple of minutes if anyone wanted to pop any last minute questions into the chat. Otherwise, I wanted to let you know that our final seminar for the year will be towards the end of October, and we'll send something out later today, but we're going to explore practical strategies to involve consumers in clinical trials. I think this is a growing area of interest in Australia, and so we're partnering with Sydney Health Partners, one of the other advanced health research translation centres in Sydney, and we've got an exciting program where we've got the leads of a number of consumer advisory committees really involved in clinical trials, speaking to us about what works and what doesn't. And so we hope that people working in the clinical trials sector find this a really valuable session. We'll circulate some details about that later today. Helena, I'd just like to thank you so much for your time today and your insights. We really appreciated hearing, all of your experience in this area is so significant, and it's been enormously valuable, I'm sure, to all of the people online. So thank you so much.
Thanks. I'm just saying I'm enjoying all the chats and feedback. I hope it was useful. But honestly, I think that the Monash Partners team have got a pretty amazing platform. Have a look at the resources before you reach out directly, but if you need help, do reach out. And for example, some of our big grants we've been involved in, we've actually taken the sort of the lead role in the consumer and community involvement part and have facilitated that, and there's actually a budget in the grant to cover that. So it's really, really sort of able to be there. But I think it's a hearts and minds thing. To me, this is about just the fundamental respectful concept that we really shouldn't do any of this without the community voice, and that, think about yourself as a community voice. Would you want someone, developing a solution or developing something that just never thought about or considered your perspective? So.
Wonderful.
Great.
Thank you, everyone, and we'll look forward to seeing you next month.
Thank you.